I remember the exact moment everything changed between us, though at the time, I thought it was just another Thursday night in March. The radiator in my dorm room had been hissing all week, filling the small space with a dry heat that made the air feel thick and stale. I had cracked the window earlier, letting in just enough of the late winter chill to balance things out, and now the room sat in that perfect temperature where you could forget about your body entirely and just exist. Grant was sprawled across my desk chair, one leg hooked over the armrest, spinning himself in slow, lazy circles. He had been telling me about Sarah from his economics class for the better part of 20 minutes, his voice animated in that way it got when he was really into a story. I was only half listening, distracted by the way the light from my desk lamp caught the edges of his profile each time he turned. There was something hypnotic about watching him talk, the way his hands moved to punctuate every detail, the way he would pause to take a sip from the Mountain Dew we had been sharing since dinner. The music was playing low from my laptop, some indie playlist I had put together during finals week that had become our default soundtrack for these late-night conversations. We had done this dance 100 times before. Grant would come by around 9, claiming he needed to borrow my notes or use my printer, and somehow we would end up talking until well past midnight, covering everything from our professors to our families to girls. Always girls. He was in the middle of describing how Sarah had supposedly looked at him during their group project when something in his voice shifted. The story faltered, and he stopped spinning the chair, his feet finding the floor with a soft thud. I looked up from where I had been picking at the label on the soda can, expecting him to continue, but instead he was staring up at the ceiling, his expression suddenly serious in a way that made my chest tighten. The silence stretched between us, filled only by the distant sound of someone playing music too loud down the hall and the steady hum of fluorescent lights in the corridor outside my door. I waited, sensing that whatever was coming next was important, though I could not have predicted what he was about to say. When Grant finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it, almost hesitant. The words came out slow and careful, like he was testing each one before letting it go. "You ever think about me that way?" he asked, still not looking at me. The question hung in the air between us, heavy and sharp and impossible to take back. I felt my heart skip, then start beating too fast, a rush of heat spreading across my face despite the cool air from the window. For a moment, I wondered if I had misheard him, if this was leading up to some joke I did not understand yet. But there was no laughter in his voice, no hint of the easy humor that usually colored everything he said. He was serious, and that scared me more than the question itself. I stared at him, trying to read his expression, but he kept his eyes fixed on the ceiling as if the acoustic tiles held some answer he desperately needed. The desk lamp cast shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp line of his jaw, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead. I realized I was memorizing these details without meaning to, the way you do when you sense a moment is about to become a memory you will return to again and again. My mouth felt dry, and I reached for the soda, just to have something to do with my hands. The metal was warm from sitting under the lamp, and I could taste the sweetness still lingering from when Grant had drunk from it earlier. The silence was becoming unbearable, stretching out until it felt like a living thing in the room with us, demanding to be acknowledged. I wanted to laugh it off, to make some joke about how he was clearly spending too much time thinking about economics and not enough time sleeping. I wanted to deflect the way I always did when conversations ventured too close to territory that made me uncomfortable. But something about the way he sat there, waiting, stopped me from saying anything at all. Because the truth was, yes, I had thought about him that way. More than once. More than I had ever let myself admit, even in the privacy of my own thoughts. I had thought about what it would feel like to reach across the small space between my bed and the desk chair and touch his hand. I had wondered what would happen if one of our late-night conversations ended differently, with something more than his usual casual goodbye and the soft click of my door closing behind him. But these were thoughts I had learned to push away, to file under the category of things that did not matter, things that were better left unexamined. Grant was my friend, possibly the best friend I had ever had, and I was not about to complicate that with feelings that were almost certainly one-sided. He dated girls. He talked about girls. He was the kind of person who moved through the world with an easy confidence that suggested he had never questioned who he was or what he wanted. And yet here he was, asking me a question that suggested maybe I did not know him as well as I thought I did. The radiator gave another loud hiss, and I realized I had been holding my breath. Grant finally looked away from the ceiling, his eyes meeting mine for just a moment before darting away again. There was something vulnerable in his expression, something I had never seen before, and it made my chest ache in a way I could not name. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but no words came. The question sat between us like a challenge, demanding honesty I was not sure I was ready to give. Because answering yes would change everything, would shift the careful balance we had built over months of friendship. And answering no would be a lie so obvious that it would probably hurt more than the truth. So I just sat there, the soda akin cold in my hands, watching my best friend wait for an answer I was not sure either of us was ready to hear. The music continued to play softly from my laptop, some song about being young and lost, and trying to figure out who you were supposed to become. Outside, someone laughed in the hallway, the sound bright and careless and impossibly far away from the small, charged space of my dorm room where everything suddenly felt different, uncertain, full of possibility and danger in equal measure. Grant was still waiting, and I knew that whatever I said next would matter more than any words I had ever spoken to him before. I had always been the kind of person who watched from the edges. Even in high school, I preferred the back rows of classrooms, the corner tables in the cafeteria, the spaces where I could observe without being observed. It was not shyness exactly, more like a natural inclination toward stillness, toward taking things in rather than putting myself out there. My mother used to say I was an old soul, but I think I was just someone who found safety in staying quiet. College had not changed that much about me. I still gravitated toward the library during busy hours, still chose classes based partly on whether I could sit near the back without seeming antisocial. I had friends, people I studied with and grabbed meals with, but most of those relationships felt surface level, comfortable, but not particularly deep. I was fine with that arrangement. I had grown accustomed to being the person others came to when they needed someone to listen, someone who would not judge or interrupt or make their problems about himself. Then Grant happened. We met during orientation week, assigned to the same group for some icebreaker activity I have tried to forget. While everyone else was awkwardly introducing themselves and sharing fun facts about their hometowns, Grant had somehow turned the whole thing into a comedy show. He had this way of finding the absurd in everything, of making observations that were just sharp enough to be funny without being mean. By the end of the hour, half our group was in tears from laughing, and I found myself actually disappointed when we had to leave. I might have expected that to be the end of it. Grant was clearly the type who collected people easily, who moved through social situations like he had been born to them. He was studying business with a confidence that suggested he already knew exactly what he wanted to do with his life. He played intramural soccer and had somehow managed to become friends with half the guys on his floor within the first week. Everything about him suggested he would have no trouble finding his place in college. No need for someone like me who preferred to fade into the background. But for some reason, he kept finding me. He would appear at my table in the dining hall, claiming all the other seats were taken even when there were obviously empty tables nearby. He started showing up in my dorm room with increasingly creative excuses for why he needed to stop by. He borrowed textbooks I knew he had already bought, asked for help with assignments and subjects I was not even taking, claimed he needed a quiet place to study even though his own room was perfectly fine. At first, I was suspicious of his attention. I kept waiting for the catch, the moment when he would reveal what he actually wanted from me or move on to more interesting company. But weeks passed, then months, and Grant just kept showing up. Our casual conversations grew longer, more personal. He started telling me things I suspected he did not share with his other friends, stories about his family back in Ohio, his worries about choosing the right major, his complicated relationship with his father who had very specific ideas about what success should look like. In return, I found myself opening up in ways I had not expected. Grant had this quality of focused attention that made you feel like the most interesting person in the room, when he was listening to you. He would ask follow-up questions that showed he was actually absorbing what you said, not just waiting for his turn to talk. When I mentioned that I was thinking about switching my major from pre-med to English, he did not immediately launch into practical concerns about job prospects the way most people did. Instead, he asked what kind of writing I was interested in, what authors I loved, what it felt like when I read something that really moved me. Those conversations became the best part of my week. Grant would settle into my desk chair or stretch out on the floor of my room, and we would talk for hours about everything and nothing. He told me about the girls he was interested in, asked for advice about how to approach someone he had met at a party, or what to text someone who had seemed receptive but had not responded to his last message. I listened and offered suggestions, grateful to be trusted with these details of his life, even as some part of me twisted uncomfortably every time he described another potential romance. Because somewhere along the way, without quite meaning to, I had started paying attention to Grant in ways that went beyond friendship. I noticed the way he ran his hand through his hair when he was thinking, the way he would absently play with whatever was in reach when he was talking about something that made him nervous. I found myself looking forward to his visits with an intensity that felt disproportionate to what they were supposed to be. When he canceled or had to cut our conversation short, I felt disappointed in a way that seemed too big for the situation. I told myself it was just because he was a good friend, the first person I had met in college who seemed genuinely interested in knowing who I was beyond the surface. But late at night, alone in my room after he had gone back to his own dorm, I would find myself replaying moments from our conversations, analyzing the way he had looked at me when he said something particularly personal, wondering if there had been something more in his expression than just friendship. These thoughts felt dangerous, so I learned to push them away. Grant dated girls. He talked about girls constantly, with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested he had never questioned his own desires. He was confident in a way that made it seem like he had never spent time wondering who he was supposed to be or what he was supposed to want. I envied that certainty, even as I tried not to think too hard about why it mattered so much to me. But now, sitting in the charged silence of my dorm room with his question hanging between us, I realized that maybe I had been wrong about Grant's certainty. Maybe he had been questioning things too, just more quietly than I had imagined. Maybe all those conversations about girls had been his own way of trying to figure out what he actually wanted, rather than simply celebrating what he already knew. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, and finally I forced out a laugh that sounded hollow, even to my own ears. I told him he was being weird, that maybe he should get some sleep since he clearly had economics on the brain too much. I tried to make it light, casual, the way I always did when conversations ventured into territory that made my chest feel tight. But Grant did not laugh back. He did not roll his eyes or make some joke about how I was deflecting. Instead, he just looked at me with that same serious expression, his dark eyes steady in a way that made it impossible to pretend this was all some misunderstanding. He said he was not joking, his voice quiet but certain. He said he had been thinking about it for a while now, about us, about what it might mean. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, a mixture of fear and anticipation that made it hard to breathe properly, because the truth was sitting right there between us, demanding to be acknowledged. Yes, I had thought about him that way, more than thought about it. I had imagined what it would feel like to kiss him, had wondered what would happen if one of our late-night conversations ended with him staying instead of leaving. But admitting that would change everything would shift the careful balance of our friendship into something unknown and potentially dangerous. So instead, I deflected again. I told him he was being ridiculous, that we were friends, good friends, and that was enough. I said it too quickly, with too much emphasis, and we both knew it sounded like exactly what it was, a lie poorly told. Grant nodded slowly, but something had shifted in his expression. He looked almost disappointed, though he tried to hide it behind a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He said, "Okay, sure, he was probably just overthinking things." He stretched and yawned dramatically, claiming he should head back to his room since he had an early class the next morning. But as he gathered up his things, moving with a careful casualness that felt forced, I realized I had made a mistake. The question was not going away just because I had refused to answer it honestly. If anything, my obvious deflection had only made it more present, more significant. The air in a room still felt charged, like the moment after lightning when you know thunder is coming. Grant paused at my door, his hand on the handle, and for a second I thought he might say something else, might push harder for a real answer. Instead, he just looked back at me with an expression I could not quite read. He said he would see me tomorrow, his voice softer than usual, and then he was gone, leaving me alone with the weight of everything I had not said. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the conversation, analyzing every word, every pause, every look. I wondered if I had misunderstood somehow, if Grant had been asking something else entirely. But no matter how I tried to reframe it, the question remained clear and unmistakable. He had asked if I thought about him that way, and my non-answer had been answer enough. The next few days were strange. Grant still came by my room, still sat in my desk chair, and talked about his classes and his weekend plans. But there was something different in the air between us, a new awareness that made every casual interaction feel loaded with significance. When he borrowed my pen, his fingers brushed mine for just a moment longer than necessary. When he leaned over to look at something on my laptop screen, I was acutely conscious of how close he was, how I could smell his shampoo and feel the warmth radiating from his skin. Our conversations began to shift in subtle ways. Grant started asking questions he had never asked before, seemingly casual inquiries that felt anything but casual. He wanted to know about my dating history, which was admittedly limited and unimpressive. He asked what I looked for in someone I was interested in, what qualities mattered to me, whether I had ever been attracted to someone I was not supposed to be attracted to. Each question felt like a small test, a way of probing the boundaries of what I was willing to admit. I answered carefully, trying to stay general enough to avoid revealing too much while still engaging with what he was asking. But I could feel myself walking a tightrope, constantly aware that one wrong word might send us tumbling into territory I was not sure I was ready for. The worst part was that I could sense Grant was struggling with the same tension. He would start to say something, then stop himself, his words trailing off into silence. He would look at me like he was trying to solve a puzzle, like there was something he needed to understand but could not quite figure out how to ask. Sometimes I would catch him watching me when he thought I was not paying attention, his expression thoughtful and uncertain. Our easy rhythm had been replaced by something more complicated, more fraught. Where our conversations used to flow naturally from topic to topic, now there were pockets of silence, moments when we both seemed to be thinking about something we could not say. The unasked question hung between us like a bridge neither of us was brave enough to cross. I told myself that things would go back to normal eventually, that the awkwardness would fade, and we would return to being just friends. But deep down, I knew that was not true. Grant had opened a door that could not be closed again, had introduced a possibility that would not simply disappear because we chose to ignore it. The question was no longer whether I had thought about him that way. The question was what we were going to do about the fact that we both knew the answer was yes. The awareness started small, like a low hum I could not quite identify. Every time Grant settled into my desk chair, I found myself noticing details I had somehow overlooked before. The way he always sat with one leg tucked under him. The way he would absently tap his fingers against his knee when he was thinking. When he moved to sit on the edge of my bed instead, claiming the chair was uncomfortable, I became hyper-aware of the way the mattress dipped slightly under his weight, how the space between us suddenly felt both too much and not nearly enough. It was the small gestures that undid me most. Grant had always been casually physical in the way that close friends often are, but now every touch felt magnified. When he reached across me to grab his drink from my nightstand, his arm would brush against mine, and I would feel that contact like electricity. When he would steal sips from whatever I was drinking, which he had done countless times before, I found myself watching his lips against the rim of the can and thinking about things I had no business thinking about. The conversations themselves began to take on a different quality. Grant had always been a storyteller, someone who could turn a mundane trip to the dining hall into an entertaining narrative. But now his stories seemed more deliberate, more pointed. He would tell me about interactions with girls at parties, But instead of the enthusiastic recounting I was used to, his voice carried a strange detachment, like he was describing someone else's life rather than his own. One evening, he was telling me about a girl named Jessica who had apparently been flirting with him in his business ethics class. He described how she had asked if he wanted to study together, how she had found excuses to text him about assignments. But as he talked, he kept glancing at me, as if he was more interested in my reaction than in the story itself. I asked him if he was going to ask her out, trying to keep my voice neutral. Grant shrugged, said maybe, but then added that he was not sure what he was looking for anymore. He said sometimes he wondered if he had been chasing the wrong things, if maybe what he actually wanted was something completely different from what he had always assumed. The way he said it made my chest tight. There was something in his tone that suggested he was not really talking about Jessica at all, but about something much closer to home. I wanted to ask him what he meant, but I was afraid of what he might say, afraid of how I might respond. These indirect conversations became our new normal. Grant would bring up dating and relationships, but always in ways that felt like questions disguised as casual observations. He asked me once if I thought it was possible to be attracted to someone for years without realizing it. Another time, he wondered aloud whether the best relationships came from friendships that slowly transformed into something deeper, or if attraction was something you felt immediately. Each question felt like a small stone thrown into still water, creating ripples that spread far beyond the original impact. I found myself analyzing every word, looking for hidden meanings and double interpretations. When Grant asked if I had ever wanted to kiss someone I was not supposed to want to kiss, I felt my face flush and had to look away, pretending to be focused on something on my laptop screen. But it was not just Grant who was changing. I was becoming someone I barely recognized, hyper-aware of my own reactions in ways that felt almost painful. I started paying attention to how I moved around him, conscious of every gesture and expression. When we would study together, I would catch myself staring at his hands as he took notes, fascinated by the way he held his pen, the small scar on his knuckle from some childhood accident he had told me about months ago. The physical space of my room began to feel different too, smaller somehow, as if the walls were gradually closing in. The distance between my bed and the desk chair, which had never seemed significant before, now felt like a chasm I was constantly aware of crossing. When Grant would move closer to look at something I was showing him on my computer, I would hold my breath, hyper-conscious of the warmth radiating from his body. Sleep became elusive. I would lie awake long after Grant had gone back to his own room, replaying conversations and analyzing moments that might or might not have meant anything. I started to understand why people talked about attraction as something that could drive you crazy, because that was exactly how it felt, like a constant low-level fever that made everything feel slightly unreal, slightly too intense. The worst part was the uncertainty. I could not tell if the changes I was noticing in Grant were real, or if I was projecting my own confused feelings onto him. Maybe his questions were just the natural curiosity of someone trying to figure out his own life. Maybe the way he looked at me was no different from how he had always looked at me, and I was just seeing what I wanted to see. But then there were moments that felt impossible to misinterpret. Times when our eyes would meet and hold for just a beat too long, when the silence between us would stretch into something that felt charged and meaningful. Times when Grant would say my name in a way that made it sound like a question, soft and uncertain and full of possibility. We were walking a tightrope, both of us balanced precariously between friendship and something else entirely. And with each passing day, each loaded conversation and meaningful glance, that balance became harder and harder to maintain. It was a Friday night in early April when everything finally came to a head. Grant had been in my room for hours, ostensibly working on a paper for his organizational behavior class. But mostly we had just been talking in the aimless way we always did. The conversation had meandered through his classes, my latest English assignment, plans for the weekend that neither of us seemed particularly enthusiastic about. But there was something different about Grant that night, a restless energy that made him seem unable to settle. He kept shifting positions, moving from the desk chair to the floor to the edge of my bed and back again. His usual easy confidence seemed strained, replaced by something that looked almost like nervousness. As the evening wore on, our conversation grew quieter, more intimate. We had turned off the overhead light hours ago, leaving only the warm glow from my desk lamp. The building around us had settled into the peaceful quiet of a Friday night. Most people either out at parties or already asleep. In the soft light and silence, it felt like we were the only two people in the world. Grant was sitting on my bed now, his back against the wall, legs stretched out in front of him. I was at my desk, turned around in the chair to face him, though I kept finding excuses to look away whenever our eyes met for too long. The tension that had been building between us for weeks felt particularly acute tonight, like a string pulled so tight it was bound to snap. We had been talking about summer plans, about going home to our respective families, and the strange feeling of slipping back into old versions of ourselves. Grant mentioned that he was dreading the questions his parents would inevitably ask about whether he was dating anyone, about when they could expect to meet a nice girl he was serious about. There was something in the way he said it that made me look up, something tired and almost resigned. He was staring down at his hands, picking at a loose thread on my comforter. The silence stretched between us, comfortable but charged the way it always was now. Then, without warning, Grant looked up and asked the question again. Not exactly the same words as before, but close enough that there was no mistaking what he meant. "So," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "have you?" His eyes were steady on mine, and this time there was no ambiguity, no room for deflection or misinterpretation. I felt my heart stop, then start again too fast. The air in the room suddenly felt thin, like we were at a much higher altitude than the second floor of a college dormitory. I wanted to look away, to make some joke, or change the subject the way I had before. But something in Grant's expression stopped me. He looked vulnerable in a way I had never seen before, like he was taking an enormous risk just by asking. My mouth opened, but no sound came out first. I tried to form the word no, try to give him the safe answer that would preserve our friendship and keep us on familiar ground. But the lie stuck in my throat, too obviously false to speak aloud. Instead, I heard myself say yes. The word came out as barely more than a breath, so quiet I wondered if he had heard me. But from the way Grant's expression changed, the way his eyes widened slightly and his lips parted, I knew he had. The admission hung between us like something tangible, something that had fundamentally altered the chemistry of the room. I felt exposed in a way that was both terrifying and strangely relieving, like I'd been holding my breath for months and could finally exhale. Grant was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching my face. Then he let out a shaky breath of his own and said the words I had never dared to hope I would hear. "Good," he said, his voice rough with something that might have been relief or fear or both. "Because I have been thinking about you too." The confession hit me like a physical force. All the careful analysis I had been doing, all the wondering and second-guessing and trying to read meaning into every glance and gesture suddenly seemed absurd. He had been thinking about me. Not just wondering, not just curious, but actually thinking about me the way I had been thinking about him. I stared at him, trying to process what he had just said, trying to understand how we had gotten here. Grant was looking at me with an expression I had never seen before, something raw and honest and slightly scared. His usual confidence was nowhere to be found, replaced by the same vulnerability I felt echoing in my own chest. The silence that followed was different from any we had shared before. It was not the charged tension of unspoken questions or the comfortable quiet of easy friendship. It was the silence of two people standing at the edge of something new and uncertain, both afraid to take the next step but unable to go back to where they had been. I realized I was holding my breath again, waiting for something to happen, for one of us to say something that would either push us forward or pull us back to safer ground. But Grant just sat there, looking at me like he was seeing me for the first time, and I found myself looking back with the same sense of discovery. We were no longer just friends pretending nothing had changed. We were two people who had finally admitted the truth to each other, and now we had to figure out what to do with it. The weight of our mutual confession settled between us like something physical, something that demanded acknowledgement. I could feel my heart beating so hard I was certain Grant could hear it across the small space of my room. We sat there in the soft lamplight, looking at each other with a mixture of wonder and terror, both of us seemingly afraid to move or speak or do anything that might shatter this fragile moment of honesty. But the truth was out now, and there was no taking it back. Grant had been thinking about me the way I had been thinking about him. All those weeks of careful analysis, of wondering if I was imagining the charged looks and loaded conversations, suddenly crystallized into something real and undeniable. We were not just friends anymore. We had not been just friends for a while now, if I was being honest with myself. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. I wanted to say something to acknowledge what had just happened between us, but I had no words for this territory we were entering. This was uncharted ground, a place beyond the careful boundaries we had maintained for months. Every response I could think of seemed either too much or too little, too presumptuous or too dismissive. Grant was the first to move. He shifted on my bed, drawing his legs up and leaning forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. The movement brought him closer to where I sat in my desk chair, close enough that I could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the way he was trying to read my expression for some sign of what I was thinking. He said my name softly, like a question, and I realized he was waiting for me to give him some indication of what happened next. The admission had been made, but we were still standing at the edge of something that felt both inevitable and impossibly risky. Because once we crossed this line, there would be no going back to the easy friendship we had built. We would either move forward into something deeper, or we would lose each other entirely. I thought about that possibility, about what it would mean to lose Grant from my life. He had become such an integral part of my daily existence that I could barely imagine my college experience without him. The late-night conversations, the casual visits, the way he made me feel like I was interesting enough to be worth his time, all of that would disappear if this went wrong. The thought made my chest ache with a fear that was almost paralyzing. But sitting there, looking at Grant's expectant face in the warm light of my desk lamp, I realized that we had already crossed the line. The moment we admitted our feelings to each other, we had changed the fundamental nature of our relationship. There was no returning to innocent friendship when we both knew the truth about what we wanted. Grant seemed to sense my internal struggle. He moved again, this time sliding forward until he was sitting on the very edge of my bed, his knees almost touching mine. The proximity made my breath catch, made me acutely aware of every inch of space between us. He reached out slowly, tentatively, and brushed his fingers against my hand where it rested on my knee. The contact was electric, sending a jolt through my entire body that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with want. Grant's fingers were warm and slightly rough, and when I did not pull away, he let his hand cover mine completely. The gesture was simple, innocent even, but it felt like the most intimate thing that had ever happened to me. I looked up and found Grant watching me intently, his dark eyes serious and questioning. There was something in his expression that reminded me of the night he had first asked if I thought about him that way, that same vulnerability mixed with determination. He was giving me a choice, I realized. He was offering me the chance to pull back, to keep this moment small and manageable, or to let it become something bigger. The rational part of my mind cataloged all the reasons this was a bad idea. We were both inexperienced with this kind of relationship, both figuring out who we were and what we wanted. We lived in the same dorm, moved in overlapping social circles, had built our college lives around a friendship that would become complicated beyond measure if this went wrong. There were so many ways this could end badly, so many opportunities for hurt and disappointment and regret. But sitting there with Grant's hand warm over mine, feeling the careful attention he was paying to my every reaction, all those reasonable concerns seemed distant and unimportant. What mattered was the way he was looking at me, like I was something precious and worth taking risks for. What mattered was the way I felt when he was close to me, like I was finally becoming the person I was supposed to be. So when Grant leaned forward slightly, closing some of the distance between us, I did not pull away. Instead, I found myself leaning toward him, drawn by something stronger than logic or caution. Our faces were close now, close enough that I could feel his breath against my skin, could see the way his eyes had gone soft and uncertain. Grant whispered my name again, and this time it sounded like a request for permission, like he was asking if this was what I wanted too. I could not find words to answer, but I could nod, just barely, just enough to let him know that yes, this was what I wanted, what I'd been wanting for longer than I cared to admit. And then Grant was closing the last few inches between us, his lips meeting mine in a kiss that was gentle and hesitant and absolutely perfect. The kiss lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like something fundamental had shifted in the universe. When we finally pulled apart, Grant's face was still close enough that I could see the wonder in his eyes, the same amazement I felt echoing in my own chest. We had crossed the line we had been dancing around for weeks, and somehow the world had not ended. If anything, it felt like it was just beginning. We sat there for a moment, neither of us quite sure what to say or do next. The kiss had been soft, tentative, more question than statement, but it had answered every doubt I had been carrying about whether this feeling between us was real. Grant's lips had been warm and slightly chapped, and I could still taste the faint sweetness of the soda we had been sharing earlier. The ordinary details somehow made the extraordinary moment feel more real, more grounded in the actual world we inhabited. Grant was the first to smile, a slow, uncertain expression that transformed his entire face. He looked younger somehow, more vulnerable, like the confident persona he usually wore had been temporarily set aside. He said he had been wondering what that would be like for months now, his voice barely above a whisper. The admission made my chest warm with something that might have been relief or joy or both. I told him I had been wondering too, though the words came out rough and unsteady. It felt strange to speak this truth aloud, to acknowledge that all those careful conversations and loaded glances had been building toward this moment. But Grant just nodded like he had known all along that we were both thinking the same thing, both wanting the same impossible thing that had somehow become possible. After a while, Grant shifted again, moving to sit beside me on the bed rather than across from me. The change in position felt significant, like we were no longer facing each other as separate people trying to navigate a difficult conversation, but sitting together as something new, something we had not quite figured out how to name yet. He leaned back against the wall, and after a moment of hesitation, I did the same, our shoulders touching in a way that felt both natural and electric. The silence that settled between us was different from any we had shared before. There was no tension now, no unspoken questions demanding answers. Instead, there was a quiet contentment, a sense of having finally arrived somewhere we had been traveling toward without quite knowing our destination. Grant's hand found mine in the space between us, our fingers intertwining with an ease that suggested this was something we had done 1,000 times before. We talked, but not about what had just happened or what it meant for us going forward. Instead, we fell back into the easy conversation that had always been the foundation of our friendship, though now it was colored by this new understanding between us. Grant told me about a book he had been reading for his literature elective, something about post-war American fiction that he was finding more interesting than he had expected. I described a short story I was working on for my creative writing class, the one I had been struggling with for weeks, but that suddenly felt like it might have a direction. The ordinariness of these topics felt important somehow, like proof that this change between us did not have to mean losing everything we had built before. We were still the same people who could talk for hours about books and classes and random observations about campus life. We still laughed at the same things, still found comfort in each other's presence. The only difference was that now we could acknowledge what had always been underneath those conversations, the deeper current of feeling that had been pulling us toward each other all along. As the night grew later, Grant's thumb began tracing small circles on the back of my hand, an absent gesture that sent shivers up my arm. I found myself studying his profile in the soft lamplight, memorizing the curve of his jaw and the way his hair fell across his forehead. There was something dreamlike about the whole evening, like I might wake up tomorrow and discover that none of this had actually happened. But Grant was solid and warm beside me, his presence undeniably real. When he turned to look at me, his eyes were soft with something that looked like contentment, like he had found something he had been searching for without quite knowing what it was. He said he was glad we had finally talked about this, glad we had stopped pretending we were just friends and we both knew it had become something more. I agreed, though the word glad felt insufficient for what I was feeling. Relief, certainly, but also a kind of quiet joy that seemed to fill every corner of my chest. We had taken a risk, had stepped off the safe ground of friendship into something unknown, and instead of falling, we had found ourselves standing somewhere beautiful and new. Eventually, Grant said he should probably head back to his own room, though he made no move to actually leave. We both knew that staying longer would only make it harder to maintain the careful boundaries we would need to navigate whatever this was becoming. But for now, in the warm circle of lamplight with our hands linked and our shoulders touching, it felt like we had all the time in the world to figure out what came next. When he finally did leave, Grant paused at my door and looked back with that same soft smile he had worn after our first kiss. He said he would see me tomorrow, but this time the words carried a weight they had never held before, a promise of continuation rather than just casual expectation. After the door closed behind him, I sat in the gentle silence of my room, still feeling the warmth where his shoulder had pressed against mine. Everything had changed, and somehow nothing had changed at all. We were still us, still the same two people who had found something rare and precious in each other's company. We were just finally brave enough to call it what it was.